Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I think so far it's been a really great series, and we're getting so many amazing contributions from members of the network on this topic, which we know is really difficult. It's quite hard to talk about race and racism, and it's really difficult to be reflective and think about our own contributions to these systems and to keeping these systems going. And today we're going to delve a little bit more into that and do a little bit more self-reflection as we think about what's taking place within our own context. I don't want to spend too much time talking about previous sessions, but I definitely encourage you to go back and watch those videos. We've had, like I said, really amazing conversations where we were able to talk a lot about what's missing, points where people are confused, not really knowing what to do, and how you can use your privilege to contribute to this conversation without drawing attention to yourself, but making sure that attention is on the people who are most affected. But today, we're going to put a lot of focus on this moment and how we got to this place and why the events that led to this moment brought us here. Why is this time different from any time before that we've been talking about race and racism? And I think it's really important to define our terms. So I want to talk a little bit about what race is. I think a lot of times we think of it as biological and as something that's inherent. And that's not the case at all. Race is actually a social construct, just like gender is a social construct. It was created by people to ensure that they would be able to hold power. And we've sort of accepted it now. Usually social constructs just kind of take over. And so, we all identify as a race, as a gender, as a particular nationality, when really you just happen to be born in a certain place. So while they do function like real structures, real things in our everyday lives, we do have to recognize that race did not exist always, all throughout history. It's something that just kind of popped up around the time of Enlightenment. If you look into that and look into some of the philosophy, I don't want to go too much in depth on that. It would take a lot of time and probably exhaust us quite a bit. But we have to remember that race was constructed to give power to white people, and have that as a foundation of the conversation as we move into talking about what racism is. And we think of racism quite simply. I think people think about it as a prejudice, but it's actually an action. You can have a prejudice without necessarily being or behaving in ways that are sexist, racist, homophobic. And there's a power dynamic that people often leave out. So there's a conversation about reverse racism and whether or not that's a thing. Spoiler alert, that's not a thing. It doesn't exist. But racism is deciding that somebody is less than you, deserves less than you because of this race that's been assigned to them, and because you're higher up and you actually have the power to keep them back. So that being said, there are protests going on across the US, but also all over the world in response to this. And people are making connections between what has taken place in the United States with policing, with having very racist systems and structures, making connections to what's happening within their own countries and within their own regions, and using this moment not just to be in solidarity with the people, with the Black people in the US, but also to bring to light some of the issues that are taking place within their own context. So making the most out of this moment. So I want to find out from those of you who've joined the conversation, what is going on within your own context right now? What are the responses like in your country or in your region?
Can I start?
Sure.
Hi, so I'm from India, and currently, while the Black Lives Matters movement has been kicking up all over, and there's a lot of solidarity via social media, in India we also have an inherently deep-rooted system which is casteism. So there are various castes, and there's the upper class, then they're called the Brahmins, and the extremely low, they're called Dalits. And over time, systemically, they have been left out, not given enough opportunities, and treated differently. So occupation wise also, they're not allowed to have certain occupations, like because earlier, and as per Hindu uh, systems, and Gunjan can also help me if I'm messing it up a bit, but because it's a Hindu based practice, and it started off in roots which in the Hindu books, it started off where the Brahmins had positions of power in terms of teaching. So they would teach the holy scriptures, and they had learned professions. So that translates to the modern context where they take positions like doctors, engineers, or in academia. Whereas as they move down the chain, the people who were taking care of manual scavenging, or stripping of animal carcasses, those were given to the Dalits. And there is a person called Dr. Ambedkar, and he was the person who wrote our constitution. He fought for their rights because he was from the same caste. And casteism is something that also came up because while many people in India were, saying Black Lives Matter, and they were posting the black square on Instagram, many people were like, why are you not looking at our own country? We're so messed up. Even as Indians, we are very racist in terms of people, darker skinned people. Like, as Indians, though we're all, we're obviously a minority, we are still, to a more darker skinned person, we have this colorism. Everyone wants to aspire to be white. Fairness creams are a big thing. So you would have seen in the media some celebrities like Priyanka Chopra and a few of them who were really, really called out for supporting the no one, they started, supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. But people said that while it's great that you're supporting it in the US, why don't you support it in our country? When we had riots, when we had protests, when people were getting persecuted, when y'all were promoting fairness cream ads, that also has such a huge repercussion. Why don't you look in your country? So that's what's currently happening in India. People are starting to read more about Dalit literature, read more of these writers. They don't get opportunities. There's a big debate in India, and I'd like to share some resources also in terms of reservation. So I think similar to affirmative action, where many people are against having reservations. So like certain quota of seats reserved for people from these sections, and select, they're called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So I think that's what's happening in India. And I definitely do feel like while with everything that's happening in America, it also has spilled over here in terms of people are accepting more that yes, we have our inherent issues as well in India, and we need to start looking at that. So that's it for me.
That's really interesting. And I actually thought about this too, and I'm hoping that we have more conversation about the caste system and what's taking place in India next week when we dive more into what is taking place in different regions and how race and racism manifest themselves in different parts of the world, because it looks quite different in different places, although the concepts remain the same. So hopefully you'll join us for that conversation next week. And you mentioned we do have a list of resources that you can add to. We'll just drop that in the chat so that you can put any links to resources that you have in there. And that goes for all of the participants. If there's anything that you've seen that's been really useful, be sure to share it so that other people can access it and learn from it as well. Does anyone else want to talk about what's taking place in their own countries or regions?
I can share a little bit about what's happening in Canada if no one else is.
Yeah, awesome.
Canada, in a lot of ways, is very similar to the US, but also very different. I think culturally and as a society here, we tend to pride ourselves on being a very multicultural, very accepting kind of community. But the reality is that racism does exist here in every single domain, whether it be healthcare or business or government. And the leadership, the higher up you go in the leadership, most of it is primarily white. And that says a lot about the decision making and where resources are allotted in the country. So I'm in Ottawa right now, which is the capital, and which is where the government sits. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had the anti-racism Black Lives Movement protest, which the Prime Minister attended. And there was this big gesture where he kind of took the knee and as a show of solidarity. And there's been a lot of kind of questioning about what we are doing beyond gestures. And it kind of links back to our previous discussions about how we want our leaders to act and to behave and portray themselves. I think particularly amongst, my friends and colleagues in the healthcare space, as well as, the younger colleagues that I've been speaking to in the community, there's been a lot of frustration, to be honest, moving beyond just kind of these kind of platitudes to actual action and actual commitment towards change. So there's been talks about, having RCMP officers, so that's our police officers, wear body cams as more kind of accountability towards their actions. But progress has been slow, I think, and that's been very frustrating. Particularly as well, I've been encouraged to see most of the news outlets are giving more of a voice to their, people of color, news representatives, as well as kind of allowing them an opportunity to speak, which has been kind of nice to see. But beyond that, I think it's been slow, and clearly this is not going to change overnight, but I think now more so there is a demand and there's a recognition beyond just the private conversations that people of color are having to actually the broader community to demand like real concrete action. So I would say that's where I feel we're at here.
Also an interesting point, especially the part about the knee. And we got into this a little bit last week when we were looking at different actions and trying to determine whether or not they were appropriate. So really curious about your thoughts, Gunjan, and other people's thoughts as well about the use of these sort of symbols and gestures. Are they useful at all? And how do we have conversations about them that move people towards action? So if you have someone who's ready to perform a gesture, how do you engage them further than that?
Yeah, you're right, Alicia. I think particularly, so in contrast with what's happening in the States and the leadership in the States that many Canadians are very critical of, I think I see both sides. On one hand, it is incredibly important to have our leaders recognize and acknowledge that racism is real, that it exists, that it impacts the lives and experiences of people. So on one hand, particularly in contrast with what's happening in the States, where there is sometimes denial, sometimes really traumatic kind of just, trivialization of experiences of people of color. So on one hand, I see the benefit in people in leadership recognizing that this reality exists. But on the other hand, especially when you have power, when you are in a position where you can really enact change, I think that without a commitment of definitive actions makes it fall short, makes it feel hollow as well. So I see both sides, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
So Ben here. I actually, while everyone was talking, I actually was thinking about Trinidad and Tobago and our context, and the fact that we're predominantly Afro-descendants and Indo-Trinidadian descendants. So we have this very interesting mix of and the minority actually being people of color. And the conversation, I don't know, Alicia, and again, this is just thoughts about the context, in your country. Racism here is, and just like that kind of Black Lives Movement, we know how independence happened within the country, emancipation and what we move towards. But I think, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, and I have to say this is my personal view, that a lot of class has a big part to play in my country, but along with class, you still see that underlying that historical tension. So we're in a country that's majority Afro-descendants and Indo-descendants, the minority still holds the majority of the wealth. And then, when we're talking about movement, and it's something that I was kind of confused about, especially in Trinidad, because we do have a lot of like when you talk about when Deane was talking about, the caste system, it's still very prevalent in Trinidad amongst certain groups. And then apart from the caste system, we have the class system. So we have caste and then we have class. So then when you're looking at how that intersects, it gets very complex. And I think in the Caribbean, Guyana shares a similar experience. But then for us, when we're looking at the Black Lives Movement and what, like how could we get past that? There seems to be some kind of hurdle. So even though, okay, you have someone taking the knee, like for us, it still gets confusing because it's not just, which is why it comes back down. And I think in some previous discussions, I mentioned systemic racism and what that looks like. Because for some countries, it's very systemic. It's not as overt as everyone will see it. It's not, because we're a majority Black and Indo country. But just for us, the manifestation of what has happened in the past and that kind of racism still lingers on because the minority, that's white, white and Syrian, because it's a complex history here, still hold the majority of the wealth. And then, how we treat the people in the majority, like they're then still being oppressed. So I think it's a tricky dynamic here. And, we try to connect with the Black, but I empathize with what's happening in the US in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. But then when we're looking at change here for our country, the approach will have to be a little different. So I don't know, I mean, Deane would speak to, because I know it's a different approach here, but Aldous, I don't know if you find it the same or anybody in a majority Black country, like I don't know if anyone finds that to kind of get that change a little bit different as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you raise an important point, particularly around the class issue. And we definitely have to talk about the fact that race and class are inextricably linked. And that's going to be kind of the crux of the conversation that we're having. I think it's 2 weeks from now on July 3rd, talking about wealth inequality and how we got there. And it's race, it's racism, it's people who were not enslaved, who were not indentured, having a head start. And Black people and non-Black people of color not having generational wealth, not being able to pass that down and not having the same advantages. But to your point on being in a country that's majority Black, the Bahamas is definitely majority Black. And I find that makes it even more difficult to have conversations about race, because people understand minority in different terms and not realizing that minority doesn't necessarily mean that you're the smallest number today. It means that it means that you're marginalized, that you're disadvantaged at this point. And so I think we're moving away from using the word minority because it causes some confusion. But like in Trinidad, that's so rich in culture and history, and you have such a mix of races and ethnicities. I think Guyana is in the same situation where there are lots of racial tensions between Black people and Indian people, very politicized as well, the same sorts of issues of wealth, class, and that kind of class distinction. And people, I think, are more comfortable to say that money and assets are the issues that kind of disconnect us, instead of recognizing that, no, these are issues of race and racism that we will have to address at some point. But right before we go to Emma, Ben, I wanted to find out from you about, because I know that there were protests in Trinidad and Tobago and there was sort of a mixed response. Can you talk a little bit about what the response was like to the Black Lives Matter protest? I think there was one that was shut down and then there was a second one.
Yeah, so it has been very, very, very mixed in Trinidad, because one, it's a discussion that it's not new. And I think again, this is just my personal stance and from having conversations with friends. So there are people that are like, no, we have to stand in solidarity with the US and, stand up against like what's been going on. And then there are people who are saying like, this conversation has been happening way too long. Like one protest in front of the US Embassy is not gonna cut it. Like I'm not gonna, take part in this, one day of solidarity thing when we have real systemic problems to start dealing with, and when we start addressing those problems then. So it has been very, very mixed. I mean, the protests have been peaceful. It's not as big as I think they would have hoped, but it has been peaceful and happening. But the approach is very divided because, again, we do have we have two major groups within our country. And one, being in the descent, they already have to face, like, the caste system is real. Like, it's not even a joke. It's what happens within that group is also very real. And then class is also very real. And it's not something that we don't see. We see it every day. So the Black Lives Movement, I think people for it in the US and what's happening there. But I think the response, especially, as you said, it still needs to be context specific. The response here needs to look at addressing particular issues, and I don't want to make a statement about that in particular, but I think it's something that we have to work towards. So it's really it's a divide, honestly, just in terms of that overt protesting, getting out there, and people saying, no, I'm not going to do that until we start really addressing some real problems.
It's interesting that seems to be happening in a lot of different places where people are not necessarily not in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and what's taking place, but having issue with other people showing such active and visible support when there are conversations in the local or the national or the regional context. It's just not happening. And I think that's something that's really important for us to be able to work through. And finding that balance between, yes, we need to acknowledge our own history and our own current reality, but that doesn't have to stop us from being in solidarity with other people and realizing that we can have multiple conversations at the same time. But how do we do that in ways that are respectful to people with different points of view when we're essentially on the same side? Emma, you wanted to tell us a bit about the context in South Africa?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm in Cape Town in South Africa. And so, I mean, we only, it's been a brief 2 decades since apartheid. And so here this is the essence of what it, like, being a South African is, like, this conversation. And so it's been really fascinating to see how we as a country engage with this conversation. We've had the same thing of people saying, like, but how could we be so outraged by something that happened to a Black American, and yet this exact same thing is happening here in South Africa, and we don't feel it in the same way. And so, but there was then this really positive development of conversation saying, like, actually we see what's happening in the States, and we're happy that it's triggered a conversation here, and let's have this conversation. But what I'm trying to, like, work out now is actually how far reaching is that conversation going? Because to me, in my circle, I feel like every single person in my network is having that conversation and engaging in this. But how insular am I so I'm actually really, I don't know what bubble I'm living in. I don't know what I don't know. But one thing that has been super interesting to me is that, so in 2015, which was the year that I got the Queen's Young Leaders Award, which made me really hungry to have this conversation then, we had the Roads Must Fall movement, which was a student-led movement against the presence of a statue of Cecil John Rhodes on our university campus. and the dramatic removal of it, which escalated into a conversation around decolonizing education and essentially responsible supply chain. So there was a call for the insourcing of, Black labor at the university, and essentially students saying, we want this institution to respect Black people. And the kind of, the nature of the conversation in 2015 was it was such an important moment, because we as a country and young people started speaking about things that we hadn't spoken about. Because when I grew up, we were given this idea of this rainbow nation. So apartheid ended and we became a happy rainbow nation. And as little kids, we'd paint pictures of rainbows and we were like, we are all together. And our country is just desperate for that moment of being no, we are not a rainbow nation. I know it, you know it, we all know it. There's things we need to say. And in 2015, it just really felt like we wanted to say it, but we had we didn't have the resources to have that conversation. Whereas now, from my perspective, it suddenly feels like, okay, we're not having perfect conversations, but we're having slightly more resilient conversations.
There was so much in that, Emma. I think that there are countries, I think South Africa is one of the countries that a lot of people all over the world look to as the country that did it, and it's funny that you say, even in South Africa, people are like, no, we're not done yet. That's not the end of the work. There's still more conversation to have. And I don't know that we'll ever be done having conversations about race and racism. We just have to keep going. We have to keep having the conversation. We have to keep preparing until we get to that place that we actually have acknowledged the wrong, and people who are not necessarily wrongdoers themselves are able to recognize that they have an amount of privilege, they have advantages, and there needs to be a rebalancing or a bringing of balance for the first time. I don't think we'll be done until we actually do that. I think we had another hand.
One of the issues that I really think is an underlying factor that probably maybe we are not looking at is the issue of the interpersonal biases, which are basically caused by our cultures. So I think there is need to change the culture, because at least we've seen some changes, policies have been changed. We can see now that we have the interracial marriages, the discrimination laws, and everything is in place. And at least some people are trying to follow the policies and everything. But the underlying factor of the interpersonal bias, because, okay, I might be working in an organization where we have very good policies and laws that are talking about racism, and people are thinking that, okay, we are following all the policies and stuff, but in one way or the other, they do small stuff that really show that such and such a person is a racist. But also, at times we all tend to think that probably racism was something which was done long time ago, and probably those who are conducting it are older persons. So when we really sit back and think, okay, this old racist man left in maybe some other part in the world is soon dying, but what will happen when he dies? If the culture is not changed, definitely if he dies, other people are taking on from him, because that interpersonal bias, which has been created by the cultures that we live in, I don't know how much I can broaden it, but I think it is something that we can really think about.
Those are excellent points, Diana. Thinking about making cultural change. It has to be a cultural shift for this work to happen. Nicholas, did you still want to contribute to this part of the conversation?
From the context of, I guess, probably Jamaica, it certainly reignited the conversation about colorism and class here on the island, and so it zeroed in on the wealth gaps and the inequality, the systematic inequalities of the entire country, with respects to the fact that, you know, like 12 to 21 people, or rather 12 to 21 families in the country actually own the wealth of the entire nation. And it brought along, I guess, a more thoughtful discussion about how that essentially bleeds into the fabric of the influences of society, with respects to the way politicians are funded, and how they essentially sway a lot of policies to appease the rich, who happen to all be white, as well as I guess the trickle-down effects with regards to how police brutality is experienced in our own country, which is very similar, if anything, sometimes much worse, depending on the context, in comparison to the US. And so what had happened during this time in particular was that even though there was, of course, I guess the riots and the protesting going on in the US, we had our own issues going on with as well. And so while we essentially stood in solidarity and protested outside of the US Embassy in Kingston, Jamaica, there were also 3 other protests going on at the same time that dealt with police brutality, because in that same week we had soldiers and police kind of just show up at someone's residence and essentially shot and kill her. She happened to be disabled, and so she was defenseless pretty much. And so we had like a few other instances that kind of culminated into this one hot mess of like a 2-week span of chaos. But yeah.
I find it difficult, I think, particularly as Ben mentioned earlier, being in countries where the majority of the population is Black. Racism becomes so ingrained, it's systemic, right? And I talked about this on another call where I was in a training with police officers, and there was some role playing going on, and you can tell that the police officers got very comfortable and they were sort of joking with each other. And one said to the others, "Oh, you know how it is when we're working downtown and we see these young fellas and we got to send them back over the hill." And what that means in the Bahamas, there is a literal hill that divides the downtown area, which is read as an area for tourists and for white people. You know, Bahamians go downtown to work in the banks and the jewelry stores, but downtown is for tourists, right? And then there's a hill, and on the other side of the hill is a historic residential area. It's a township, and there are quite a number of families getting low incomes who live in that area. And so what this officer was really saying is, when we see young men downtown, the area that's for the white tourists, we tell them to go back home because this is, they don't belong here. And these are Black officers. But this is the way that racism is, 1, internalized, and 2, systemic. Because, we all know police officers, defense force, all of these military and, law enforcement divisions, departments, whatever, they receive training that's quite intense. It's not long enough. It doesn't cover enough. They don't get trained on, social services and dealing with people who are vulnerable, but they get kind of a one-size-fits-all training. And they're taught what criminals look like. And they look like men, Black men with locks, Black men with locks who drive Hondas, for us. And it becomes, it's stereotyping, and it is a power that we exert over each other. And how do you deal with that? And that was an excellent point that you made, Nicholas, that leads right into my next question, which is, how do we participate in or challenge systems where racism is ingrained. And I want you all to think about that. And I would love to hear from you about how you're either challenging or, however, inadvertently participating in racist systems. And this could be education, this could be health, this could be law enforcement. It could be so many different things. Like I can think about education, I think within the Caribbean region for sure. If you're going to a private school, there are specific reasons that your parents are sending you to a private school as opposed to a public school. And there's a specific way that you're meant to behave. There are workplaces that don't allow certain hairstyles or even certain hair textures because they don't look clean enough. And they're looking for you to sort of bring yourself up to this Eurocentric standard of beauty. So has anyone thought about any systems that you're actively participating in or working to challenge?
I've had this personal conflict since I've become, I guess, more aware of the space that I happen to work and operate in, which is tech, which is why I kind of got out of the pure digital capitalism space for a bit to get into the nonprofit philanthropic scene. But it's still very, I feel like I'm still, I guess, operating within the same toxicity. And so every time that I speak about tech or advocate for tech in certain ways, it has to be under the guise of, I guess, appeasing to management or the system. And the system in this sense happens to be venture capitalists who have a whole pot of money, who happen to be white, and just generally technologists as well, to basically get resources or pretty much like get funding. And so that is something that I'm hyper aware of in terms of, you know, how I participate in that space, with regards to how, like, for instance, I also like show up or tell people how to like run their own tech startups, which is a blitz scaling model, which is focused on something known as like hyper growth or hyper scaling, which is like a 10x, 100x model. That model is not sustainable, and it really preys on the systematic effects of racism and classism and capitalism overall, because it inherently takes advantage of the flaws within a certain demographic, or rather it takes advantage of people and spaces that are ignorant to a lot of things. And so that is more or less permeated throughout the demographics that happen to be underserved, which happen to be minority groups, which happen to be mostly Black. And so every day I more or less like try to challenge myself to more or less think along the lines of how I could possibly make some kind of change in that regard. But yeah.
That is, yeah, it sounds very specific, like the tech industry, but it's something that happens across the board and within nonprofits, between nonprofits. Ben, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I did. So I think your question was a fantastic one, and it actually had me thinking a lot in terms of how do you, you know, work against those forms, for example, like systemic racism, and, you know, just working against those structures that exist. And it threw me for a bit, and then I remembered looking at Miss Universe. Was it Miss Universe this year or last year? Sometime I was looking at Miss Universe. It's a weird reference. But I was looking at Miss Universe, and one of the contestants, she had I think she was Jamaican, big afro. And I was just like, yes, 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 yes. Because because it was like for me, it wasn't just an important moment that, you know, she was at Miss Universe with her afro, but it was the fact that she was taking up space. And when we are looking at, you know, systems and how we, you know, just work against them, I think one of the simplest ways we could start, you know, pushing against those systems is really taking up space. So I mean, I know they have this whole movement going on where you want, like, you know, they're asking questions in terms of who is on your board? Are there any Black people on your board? You know, you like, Black people make up a particular part of the executive, or even colored people on the whole, like minority groups, are they part of that decision-making process? And I think it's important, and I think that is really one way, you know, if anything, if anybody is thinking about it, like, you know, how can I work against this big system? One of, I think, the most important fundamental things we could ever do is just be present, never deny ourselves, you know, the chance to take up space, you know, go, because I did something, and I'll admit this. I did something a few years ago. So I went to shelter training in the UK, and it was a humanitarian shelter training. And I walked into the room, and when I walked into the room, the first thing I noticed, I was the only Black person in the room. There was no one of color, absolutely no one of color. And I stepped in here, I was like, oh my God, isn't this like supposed to be like for humanitarian work? Like, I swear these people are working in like developing countries. Why is everybody white? And I felt super uncomfortable for the full 40 minutes that I stayed. And then I left. And then I left, I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. I just aborted. And, you know, I walked away from that experience, and I was like, you know, sometimes you're in a space and I don't know, probably it's just me, but it was just too much all at once. Coming from, well, I mean, it's not like I lived in countries that's predominantly white, but just when I was expecting the space itself to be different, and then having to realize that, okay, these are the people doing humanitarian work in these countries, and they don't look nothing like the people that they're helping. Like, it was just too much to process at once. And I just left, and then I remember thinking, no, that was the wrong thing to do. Because in spaces like that, I must never deny myself the opportunity to take up space, because we all deserve to be there. It's not like, you know, no one is less than, you know, and just that your question for me, it really had me thinking a bit. And I think the most important thing any of us could do, any person of color, or even somebody who's not Black, somebody who's white, you know, make room. I think making room and taking up space is what we could do to really start tackling those kind of systems.
I think we could take it even a step further and ask why everyone in the room looks the same. You know, where is the diversity in the room, and challenge people to do better, right? Nige, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Did you want to make a comment too?
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you. My name is Desmond G. As you rightly said, it's very obvious how I look. I come from Africa, of Cameroonian origin, and I'm happy to join this discussion. You see, when I used to grow up in Cameroon, I used to hear about what racism is all about, and the struggles of people of color, as they would call them, in the Western world, and didn't really feel what it was until I came to the West myself and saw for myself what is happening, and devastated nature in which our brothers and sisters are going through. And the case in point with George Floyd is one of so many of those we've been grappling with. I must say that I have been meditating this while about all what is going on in the world. But I've also had a lot of questions, coming in my mind. One of the very first questions is on the word racism itself. What is racism? Where did this word start? Alicia gave some interesting insights on racism, conceptual underpinning of the word. But I think the word racism itself is racist because we keep on categorizing people. And obviously, you said it all, that it starts from people wanting to wield power on others. And it comes from categorizing people, trying to make us feel apart. That's apartness. It's actually the principle of apathy. And so we have the Black Lives Matter movement today. And if we are not careful, it may not be a Black lives that would matter in future. It would be blue lives or yellow lives if they do exist. So we must be careful how we treat this issue. We want to dismantle racism. We want to take it off. It's been so ingrained in the system. I mean, it's terrible. It's well rooted. It's going to take lots of effort to get it out there. And it starts with you and I. We have to question some of this vocabulary. And I think it's never been important. That moment is now. Start questioning, what are some of the words we use? These words that we use, are they essentially correct? Are they right? Do they uphold the principle of justice among us? I would like to say that there was a post which I wrote some time ago, and just to answer your question, Alicia, in brief, I think that the issue of racism, which incorporates prejudice against people of other skin colors, also needs the intervention of homes and governments. Governments have a task to dislodge this infelicitous attitude. It ought to be a part of governance and accountability. It is likened to, a home where children have come in from other homes or from other parents, and the children in that home frown at the presence. The parents of the home have the task to explain to them that, these are your brothers and sisters. Love them. This does not in any way debase the fact that we need, a consolidated effort, to dislodge racism in our society. Parents have an uphill task to tell children, to inform children that we are all human beings. There is no such difference between us. We are just fooled by the difference in the color of the skin. It's just the skin color, and it can be explained biologically. And so it's needless referring to someone as white or black sometimes, because I haven't seen anybody who is as black as what I know black is, or as white. That's what I know white is. These are just human fabrications, ridiculous fabrications, which I think we need to question and try to revamp, try to refurbish, try to change as soon as possible. If not, we keep on coming back to the same matter, winding time on it, and as soon as one system is fixed, say Black Lives Matter, tomorrow some other thing pops up, we start another fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, G, and sorry for the mispronunciation of your name. I think I swapped letters around. Yeah, it does. I think it does start at home and having conversations with children, especially if you're living within small communities or towns where everyone looks the same, to let your children know that there are some people who look different, and you will see other people treat them differently. and you're not to participate in that. Here is what you are to do, and teach children to be anti-racist. She makes a comment here, because her mic isn't working, so I'll just read it. She says, this is something where we feel passionately about as whites running an organization in Uganda, and have found it so frustrating. We want Ugandans and the community to be fronting the organization. That is, we purposefully didn't want to front the organization, to use our photos on the website and social media, and have been advised by some funders, and she makes very clear, not QCT, if we didn't use photos of us, we'd be less likely to get funding. And this is just, it's so real. I have definitely been in positions where I have not been able to access funding because I refused to share pictures of the people that we're helping. Even in my hurricane relief work, partnering with another organization, and they just kept insisting that they wanted photos. They wanted to see photos of distributions taking place. And the only thing that I could really offer was, maybe I could take some pictures from behind, but I don't want to expose people who are coming for assistance. They're already vulnerable. We don't need to plaster their photos around anywhere. But so many funders and individual donors count on these photos as evidence of the work, and there just has to be a better way than making already vulnerable people more vulnerable, you know, and using their images without their consent. And even if you get their consent, you're getting it under duress because they have to come to you for help. Do they really want to say no to a photo? You know, so it's just, it's so layered. And I totally hear what you're saying there. That's really difficult to deal with, and hard to be running an organization in a country with Black people, people of color, and being pressured that you need to show photos of yourself as a white person. I mean, how do you navigate that? I don't know. I don't have the answer. That's really tough. I mean, how do you push back though? G, do you respond to them? Do you tell them your reasoning for not wanting to be on the website? I know it'll take you a minute to type, so we can come back for your response. But in the meantime, does anyone else have anything to share about what you're doing to challenge systems, or how you might have found yourself participating in systems where racism is ingrained? I don't see any more hands, so we'll come back to see if she gives us a response. Did Diana, did you want to say something?
Yes, so I just wanted to contribute on Jay's point, what he was talking about. So he was saying that it all starts from home. So I was looking at this situation where the home itself, the parents are racist. So it won't start from there, definitely, it won't. But then where will it start from? I think we also need maybe to, I don't know, maybe sensitizing or advocating for like racism topics to be conducted in schools, because at least we find that children spend a lot of time in schools, more than at times they spend time with their parents. So if I think the sensitization starts from the schools, and then probably they find the same words in the community, probably these would be also the people who would also change their parents. Like I think a month ago, I was watching a certain video on Facebook, and a teenager, she was challenging her parents on racism, because the parents were like, no, we are superior. Those people are nothing. And the girl was seriously talking to the parents, you know, these are human beings. We are all people. We deserve equal opportunities. It's just that they are just like that because they have been denied opportunities. And their parents were seriously telling her, you know, you can look at us. We are very superior. We have the knowledge. We have the technology. We have this and this and this and that. And the girl was just telling them, you colonized these people in the first place. How do you expect them to have the same opportunities the way you have? So I really think, where was this girl getting all this information from? Probably she had it from the school, or she read it somewhere or something, and then she was like, I think my parents are not doing the right thing. And here she was trying to educate the parents. So if we can have like more children, like let me say 100 children like her, then we would have like 100 parents changed their perceptions or their views. At times they might not change, but at least those children can impact others to change. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It can't just depend on the home, but these conversations should be taking place in the school, within communities. And I think this is why one of the reasons that social media is so powerful. I think a lot of people are getting a lot of information, gaining knowledge, and actually being taught to think more critically from seeing what people are experiencing and what people are sharing on social media. G, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have been a strong advocate for sexuality education in schools. And one of the major reasons is, parents do fail to take up the responsibility to teach children these essential skills. And it's likewise the case with human solidarity. Yes, I think it's a curriculum that it's something that needs to be added in the school curriculum for students or children to start learning that we ought to accept one another for who we are, because that's how we are, that's how God created us. No one created himself the way we look. And essentially, our diversity is something that we should celebrate. This is something we also need to teach the children. We need to celebrate our diversity. I said in a post that flowers of different colors combine to make a glamorous bond, don't they? And that is how I see the diversity of the human race. Consider that's a human race. So we need to celebrate this diversity. I've always loved, I've attended so many global meetings, and I just love the color, the colorfulness, of such platforms. We need to start instilling in young people a sense of global citizenship. And this, needs to take place if we broaden the scope of our curriculum, include subjects that teach children the realities of other parts of the world. One of the things I strongly support is trying to get these kids to go to other communities and let them see the reality. Sometimes we just learn, we just hear from the media, and we build perceptions about other people, that this is how they look like, this is how they behave. They are far down there in the echelon of society. But when you get there and you see what these people love, you mingle amongst them, changes that perception entirely. So very strongly, I really support families to take this into consideration, but also the education system needs to get it into its curriculum as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think that there are some resources out there for people who are wondering how to have these conversations with children, with students. There are a number of resources available. There are books, there are some guides. I actually spoke with someone yesterday who has started a white space, which is just for white people to come together to learn how to be anti-racist. And she's sharing different resources, and she's made it clear that, this white space is not about segregation, but it's about being able to teach and to learn together without traumatizing and re-traumatizing Black people and asking Black people questions, and not exposing us to whatever it is that they're struggling with. So creating that separate space, which I think is a pretty interesting idea. And I asked her if she was going to put together some sort of template or a guideline for people who wanted to do it somewhere else, because the work that she's doing is regional. And she said that once she gets it going, that she'd be able to produce that resource. So these are the kinds of things that people can and should be doing for sure. We have the follow-up from T. Elliott about having an organization in Uganda. And she says it's also within the organization, because we were white, we get automatic respect called madam or sir. So we try and challenge that within the team. In terms of pushback with funders, we try and limit the number of images on social media, but we find we raise far more money where people from the global north see people from the global north running the organization. And so we then have to weigh up whether we use our privilege and show our faces so that we can raise the money to have more impact. It's a constant battle. That's a really difficult thing to have to balance. And it comes down to that a lot of the time. Do you want to have principles? Like, do you want to be so principled that you can't get the money that you need to do your work, to do the work that would further your principles and teach them to other people? You know, how do you balance that, and how do you challenge the people who you're depending on to provide your resources?
Can I jump in, because
Sure,
I had
Emma.
the same problem, and I don't have the money. And I couldn't bring myself to do it. And one will never be able to go back and know what I could have done with that money. But yeah, anyway, in sort of response, which, yeah, great question. Like such a great broad question that you've posed us, Alicia. But one of the things that I suppose I'm doing, so my work is actually really similar to yours, Nicholas. And I'd love to find out more about your work. But essentially training youth with coding and technology skills and allowing them to find employment in our tech industry here in Cape Town. And essentially, I've tried to like work out like what is my role and how do I use the fact that I came through an apartheid education system and got an incredibly privileged education, and I have access to like certain social capital. And so for instance, one of the things that I can do is I can sit and advocate directly to employers who are majority white. Like it's pretty, we can round off like closest denominator, like white employers, and advocate for instance, against unpaid internships, because unpaid internships are one way that we essentially make gaining experience and jumping ahead in industry only accessible to rich people, which means white people. And being able to, for instance, like translate a candidate's profile, because for instance, like when a white person applies, it's a smaller, we're the minority. So everyone knows everyone. So you know someone's father, and la la la, and oh yes, la la la, oh we went canoeing together. And it's very easy to get employment because of all that social capital. So for instance, I can then stand as kind of a translation point between my graduates and employers and be able to kind of use that position. And then the really, another, I mean, sort of the same tension with the funding issue is like, how do you, so one wants to create, like as quickly as possible, you want to move the money in this country from white to black. But the current system is set up as a white system. So to get employment, there's one option, which is just act white and get employment. But that's not winning. Sure, you've got money in your bank account, but we're not winning yet. So being able to, I suppose, again, kind of like very, very small thing. One thing that comes to my mind is sitting with one of my students and who'd written an email saying, using the word beg, like, I beg you to please like look at this, to look at my profile. I was like, please don't use the word beg again. You can request, you can ask, you can suggest, you can propose, but you don't need to beg. Like you don't need to do that. But then being able to help someone know, like, okay, this is the moment when this, like for instance, spelling, because white people speak English and so they all want perfect spelling. That is like, it's like, well, just ask me to read over things. Like don't get that wrong, because people can't overlook that. Like we haven't yet got that far. so being able to like know, and that confidence building with people of like, okay, yes, we just want the fastest route to the highest earning employment, but on the other hand, you have to be authentically you. And I don't want to be the person telling you not to be authentically you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a way to go about it, Emma. I think you call it being a translator, but like being that person in the middle who can advocate with people who look like you.
Yeah, translator is the right word.
Yeah, I know. Actually, when I was rethinking, I was like, yeah, translator actually does kind of work. But I guess like an intermediary, like a go-between, a matchmaker. I don't know. But using your position and your relationships to be able to move the people in your program through sort of career opportunities, trying to get them to different places, because these people have a trust in you because of who you are or their relationship to you or what you have in common. And so if you recommend someone, they will accept that because you're Emma and they know you.
Yeah. And like
right?
spending social capital, and then also convincing other white people that they have social capital and they're able to spend it, and be like, actually, how much is it going to cost you to spend this? Why don't you spend some?
Yeah. So that I think of that as like a temporary measure, or something that goes along with something else. So in the meantime, you're doing this, but we like need to work towards something different where people aren't in a sort of insular bubble and I only deal with people who are in my bubble. Like you need to get people out of that bubble, but while they're in it, you have the Emmas
How do we?
who are trying to say, I know this person, they're outside of the bubble, but let me bring them in. I mean, that's a way to go about it, but I think it's a temporary. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, one thing that's so helpful is being able to have these conversations. Like you sit and you deal with all of this all the time. It's nice having a safe space.
Yeah. All for people activating their privilege and figuring out how to make who they are and what they are work for people who don't have the same advantages and who are actually disadvantaged because they don't hold the same identity and the same privilege as you have. So I think that's a really good example. I really also want to find out from you all, what kinds of resources and support do you need and that you haven't found? Like, what do you wish existed to help you to do your work, to stand in solidarity, to be allies and accomplices and co-conspirators? Like, what would make that easier or feel more accessible to you, or what would make you feel more confident or more informed so that you can actually perform more actions that are meaningful and impactful? Does anyone have any ideas around what would be particularly helpful right now? I can leave that to the chat. So if you think of anything, you can just pop it in there. And I'm going to move on to the last question because we're down to our last few minutes. And I really want us to think about what makes this moment different from any other moment. And I think a lot of people who jumped into the conversation today pointed to the fact that this is not the first time. This isn't the first time that we're having conversations about race and racism. This isn't even the first Black Lives Matter protest. This isn't the first point along the continuum that is a movement. We're probably not even in the middle, much less the end, but there's something about this moment that has brought so many people to the table to have discussions and to take action and to want to do more and to want to make our society better and more equitable and to challenge people to think differently. What is it about this moment? What's brought us to this point now? Can you think of anything that is different, or do you think that we're just different? Is it a connection with a particular incident, like what happened with George Floyd? Was that like, have you seen reports on police brutality and murders of Black people before, but this one just like struck a chord with you? What makes this moment different?
With this particular one, because of the lockdown, it was more people were aware of it. That's what I think, because everyone's sort of social media was, people were at home, so it was just more visible and people were less distracted, so to speak, because they're at home, they're watching TV, so it's just sort of being visible. And also I think people are more what's the word, they're more, I say during the lockdown they're more empathetic because they're more aware of the disparity and the problems that could go on with the lockdown, how people's lives have sort of changed, and just how people are more vulnerable. So I think there was a culmination of things, and it just which all exacerbated the situation. That So I think there was a combination of things, but I think it just, that's what led to it probably being different. It's probably not the only reason, but there were just, it was almost like a laid effect, which led to people wanting to actually do something about it. And yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah,
Personally.
that's interesting. So people kind of have more time, or they're spending more time online or paying attention to the media. And so maybe the volume of reports on it, or seeing more reports around George Floyd, issues from before, from after. And I think now that you bring it up, it could also have to do with COVID-19 and the fact that people have been locked down for so long for our safety. And now there are Black people who have broken the lockdown and who are going outside and risking it because that is what we feel is necessary to save our lives. So putting our lives at risk in the moment to save our lives in the long run, like maybe that's something that also has resonated with people. Are there any other thoughts on what brought us to this moment and to this point of like feeling like we have to do something more than hashtag Breonna Taylor, hashtag George Floyd, hashtag Sandra Bland?
Sorry, so I think there were some things behind the scene that were taking place that, in terms of the media and people sort of putting out messages, and also, for example, let's say the American politics, so to speak. So I think people have been observing that, for example, and I think some people have just sort of had a bit of unrest or unsure of where the world is heading. So I generally think there was a lot of different things. I can't pinpoint what it is exactly, but yeah, it was a combination of things. And I think because we've been through a series of protests and uprisings and all across the world, and you're seeing, for example, like the rise of fascism a lot more. So it's building, should I say?
Yeah.
And I think people can resonate
Definitely.
with a lot of different things. So.
For sure. Calvin, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, Kofi, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think definitely layers to this. I think that one of the big things, aside from COVID and sort of people having more attention, is that racism, I think, has been, certainly in my experience, has been saying, actually, hold on a second, this guy and many others have been willing to put themselves in so much discomfort. I can use my Twitter feed, or I can start to have a conversation that it makes me uncomfortable. So I think it's just, we've come to this kind of point of critical mass where there has now been too much, and it's sad that so many people have had to die, and so many people are still dying. Before, I think we're, to be honest, going to get to kind of real generational change. And I think the question that I'm asking again and again, and my grandkids am going to have the same conversation with my grandkids that my parents have had to have with me about staying safe and what to do when the police pull you over and whatever else. But yeah, I think it's just like Kofi was saying, and many others have mentioned, lots of different factors have come to this point in time that have meant too much has happened, and people are wanting real change.
Thanks for that, Calvin. I think you raised some good points that sort of echo some of the things that we were talking about. Just where we are politically, our histories, many of which are very, very complicated, and being in a space where there's so much going on. And Emma says in the chat, being in the space with the pandemic that's threatening everything that we thought we knew, the normal that we had can be no more, and we are recognizing that there's something that we have to do about it. And I asked the question about what brings us to this point now, why it makes a difference now, is because I think it's important for movement leaders and people who are part of movements to know what events are catalysts for change. And sometimes it's just like total pandemic mode. It's fear, it's confusion, it's not knowing what the new normal should look like. So I think we really have an opportunity here. We're at a turning point, and it's up to us as a collective, individually, but also as a collective, to determine how we're going to turn this corner and which direction we're going to take the world in. And I'm really happy that you've joined this conversation and that QCT has created a space for us to talk about these things, and to be able to share ideas and ask our questions and challenge ourselves and each other, because without that, we still remain too comfortable, and we clearly have to be very uncomfortable to be able to make the change that's necessary.